with Tabish Khair, who is currently teaching at Aarhus, Denmark, and was
Hello.
born
Yeah.
and educated in Gaya, Bihar.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Tabish,
not getting the sound anymore, and picture seems to freeze once in a while.
so we are joined with Tabish Khair, who is currently teaching at Aarhus, Denmark. Tabish was born in Gaya, Bihar, and he was educated there, and then he did his PhD in Copenhagen. He is the winner of the All India Poetry Prize, and he has been shortlisted for major prizes in India and abroad, such as the Encore Award and the Man Asian Prize. Tabish, welcome to LitFestx.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So we are discussing today, Tabish, the world of differences. Your recent book, Xenophobia, the new Xenophobia, talks about how the fear of strangers has evolved over the last so many years, and clearly we are living in times where a kind of xenophobia is re-emerging the world over, and for various reasons. Some partly wrong, partly correct. But tell us a little bit about what your study has been showcasing.
Okay. Well, xenophobia or hatred or fear of a stranger, I mean, goes back all the way through history. And usually a lot of people argue that there's something about us as human beings that makes us dislike or fear strangers. On the other hand, you also have lots of stories and lots of traditions where the stranger is welcomed. In India, for instance, or in the Middle East, in Europe, all religions have excerpts that ask you to actually treat the stranger well, to welcome the stranger, and so on and so forth. So I don't really believe that there's anything essential in human being that makes us hate or love strangers, their tendencies. So now, what is it that brings one of these tendencies to the forefront? Why is it that in phases or in places people come to hate strangers more than in some other phases? And that's basically what this book looks at. I also look at how the hatred of a stranger has to do with struggle for power, with how power is negotiated and how power is used by politicians to negotiate their own careers and so on and so forth. So those are things I look at by and large in that book.
So Tabish, when we talk about fear of strangers, clearly I think the evolution, or one can say the new xenophobia, is not really merely just the fear of strangers. It is just a fear of anybody who is different, right? So,
Yeah.
so if, for example, if we look at the entire Brexit vote, or
Mm,
the rhetoric in the run up to the elections in the United States,
mm,
there's enough evidence to say that people are
mm,
being pushed to become afraid, or
mm,
stay clear of anybody who's different.
mm, mm. Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
has been your research around that?
Yeah. Sure. Um, See, part of the problem is that we have entered a phase of capitalism, which people very often call global capitalism or neoliberalism or whatever they might call it. And that is extremely difficult for ordinary people to understand. Brexit is a good example of that. The highly complex nature of the world today makes people, especially people who might have less access to other spaces and privileged education at times, fear what is happening. That fear is very difficult to locate in any kind of intellectual complex. It's much more easy to actually point that fear towards a stranger and say, well, I'm not doing well because of immigrants, because of X, Y, Z. And I argue in that book that actually the changing nature of capital has also led to a change in xenophobia. So while some people still react to strangers in what I consider an older way where they focus on physical differences. There are new forms of xenophobia coming up which are highly abstract. So you don't really talk of people being black or people being Jews and so on and so forth. You talk of abstract reasons to discriminate against people, economic reasons to discriminate against people. Of course, much of the discrimination is still aimed at people who were discriminated against in the past for not abstract reasons for being black or for being gypsies or being Jews and so on and so forth. So it's a very complex situation at the moment, and politicians do not help matters by taking what one can call shortcuts to power, playing on people's fears rather than using information and trying to address real issues. Yeah.
When we are talking about how the new capitalism
Yeah.
and increasing elements of xenophobia, how do you think these two are interplaying? Where do you see this emerging going forward?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last bit of your question.
I'm saying, how do you see the new capitalism and
Yeah.
politicians sort of,
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
control
Sure.
or,
Yeah.
or
No,
re-
no,
need for control
yeah.
and xenophobia? How do you
Yeah.
see both
Sure.
these
Sure.
working ahead?
Sure. Well, it's a very complex discussion, so I'll just put it across in as simple a manner as I can, which means that I'll simplify it a bit. In the past, capital was located in what I would call production, money, cash, and so on and so forth. A lot of it was abstract, but most of it had some kind of location in production, in trade, and in cash. Capital existed as cash to a large extent, or gold, and so on and so forth. Now, most of the capital that exists in the world doesn't even exist in any form. It only exists as numbers. Okay, and in that sense, capital itself has become highly abstract. And what I argue is that with this abstraction of capital, the way we see strangers has also become abstract. And in that sense, old capital, because it was located in production, in trade, in cash, in precious minerals, very often constructed a stranger who also had a bodily location, a bodily presence. New capital, because it's so abstract, very often constructs strangers in largely abstract terms. But of course, this is how strangers are constructed. This doesn't mean that the stranger becomes abstract. The stranger obviously has a body, and in that sense, new xenophobia still impacts on the body of the stranger. People are discriminated against. People are persecuted. People are not allowed access to better lives, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And when you are writing about xenophobia, and you've got your next novel coming up as well, um, you know, how are you treating these subjects differently in your writing? Is there a increasing focus on sort of looking into the future, or is it more of sort of reporting what you see?
Well, in the new xenophobia, I basically talk of xenophobia as in a scholarly manner, and I look at xenophobia as it has developed over, I would say, 200 years. Okay, I'm not that interested in ancient history because obviously people think differently, people live differently, and I don't want to make generalizing statements. So, but then I focus on xenophobia as it is coming in first world spaces. Now, first world spaces are themselves very problematic now. In the past, one could talk of the first world and the third world. But now, actually, you have first world spaces in the third world too. They're extremely privileged spaces that only comprise a few people living in big cities with access to high capital. So that discussion itself becomes very complicated. However, it is a study. I mean, in my other book that I published this year, which is actually a novel, Jihadi Jain, I take up what can be considered another side of it. because a lot of what is happening in the Middle East is also a form of xenophobia. In some ways, a very old-fashioned form of xenophobia, persecuting people because of their religion, because of their lack of religion, and so on and so forth. So I think, by and large, at the moment, I have been very interested in this complex of issues. Yeah.
So coming back to your current book on xenophobia,
Yeah. Yeah.
clearly, increasingly we even find media playing to the rhetoric of
Yeah.
politicians in many places.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, what is the
Yeah.
interplay you find between media fanning or bringing
Hmm.
xenophobic issues to the fore?
Hmm. 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 Yeah, I mean, media plays a big role, just as politicians play a big role. And obviously, media, by focusing on there are various reasons. I mean, uh, especially when it comes to television and such forms of media rather than old-fashioned print media, what one needs is constant action. One needs sound bites. One needs something to grip the viewer and keep the viewer gripped for a few minutes. The viewer's attention slips much faster when people watch something online or on television. And because of that, there's a tendency to focus on politicians who come up with scandalous statements with good sound bites and so on and so forth. A good example is Mr. Trump in USA. I mean, the media has been covering him a lot, much more than other candidates, actually. And that's partly because of his ability to come up with sound bites. So in that sense, obviously, the media tends to focus on people who come up with the statements that totally wrong, can be totally wrong, not just in the moral and ethical sense, but also totally wrong in a factual sense. That doesn't matter. What matters is the impact, the assonance and the resonance of that statement. So, in that sense, the media definitely plays a big role. Another problem, of course, is that more and more media outlets are privately run. They're controlled by big capital. Ordinary people have very little say in how a media decides to depict an issue. On the other hand, people with money and people with political power do have much more say in how a media is run, and those things obviously impact on how news is covered, how people are portrayed, how issues are discussed, and so on and so forth.
And do you find that going forward, do you think the internet, digital media, the entire social media movement, do you think that has the power to bring about any positive change amongst these xenophobic sort of environment that is emerging?
Well, technology tools, they always have different aspects. I mean, any tool can be used for something good and for something bad. And social media is very much like that. I'm very sure it can be used in a good way, but it also comes with certain drawbacks that are built into the system. For instance, the kind of trolling that one witnesses. That happens more on social media because when you connect to people online, for instance, or no on Facebook and so on and so forth, um, in some ways you're talking to someone, but in some ways you are just talking into a mirror. It's not like sitting down with someone in a drawing room or out on the street and having a conversation, because then that person's presence, if you are civil and if that person is civil, and I'm assuming basic civility, um, makes it necessary for you and for him or her to talk in ways that are civil. So your differences are negotiated. You're not hostile necessarily, unless of course that conversation breaks down. That might not be the case in social media. Again, social media enables you to connect with people all over the world, which is very good. But then it also enables you to select people who think exactly like you do, which means that in some ways it can help you open up your mind, but in some ways it can also help you close down your mind. So yeah, so there are advantages, there are disadvantages, and what people make of social media will depend on the people behind social media. Again, whether it's a computer, whether it's something like Facebook, these are all tools, they're technologies, and they can be used well. They can use for good, or they can be used for evil.
Very interesting point, Tabish. You know, we are about to bring the session to an end. So, a final question to you. When we are looking at the relationship which is emerging between power,
Yeah.
capitalism,
Yeah.
xenophobia, and and let's throw in for good measure the new emerging geopolitical landscape. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, where do you think we are headed? Where do you think we are headed? Let's
You,
get some crystal
okay.
ball gazing from you.
Okay, I'll reformulate the question a bit because I'm not sure I didn't get a bit in the middle. So basically, what you want me to talk about is when I look at the relationship between xenophobia, capital, and power, where do I see us as a world heading?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but that's basically the
Yes,
question. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Um, Look, prophecies are very dicey things. I don't believe in prophecies. So, all I, and in that sense, I would not want to say that I know where we are heading. Okay, but what I can say is I can point at what might happen and what might not happen in the present, and I think at the moment this intense focus on strangers as being the reason why things go wrong is strongly misleading, because the reason why things go wrong is not because you have a few hundred refugees or immigrants coming into your country. It has a lot to do with the way money operates and the way politicians enable money to operate. You and me as middle class people, for instance, cannot evade taxes, uh, and we shouldn't. On the other hand, much of big business internationally exists and lives off evading what you would call taxes. Okay, and it's not India or America; it's the entire world. I mean, governments allow these loopholes to people who have billions. They don't allow these loopholes to people who have salaries like we do. So that is far more important than a few strangers in your neighborhood. On the other hand, of course, I must say that a degree of suspicion of strangers is also human, because you don't know the stranger. People also, to some extent, need to belong. And if you've grown up in a village, for instance, if you look at traditional villages in India, when I was growing up, villages, there were still a few traditional villages hidden away in different parts of India. And they tended to be reasonably clean. The more modern a village gets, the dirtier it gets. Towns get dirty. Cities get dirty because a lot of people don't feel they belong there. So in that sense, again, there is a need to feel, because we will live in a global world. People will move around. There's nothing that we can do to stop that, and I don't think we should try to stop that. But there's a need to come up with an awareness that goes beyond your particular identity and enables you to relate to larger identities as human beings, as global citizens, and so on and so forth. So these things need to come up. I mean, they are coming up slowly, but we are still way behind. We are still nowhere close to where I had hoped 20 years back we would be. In some ways, we have been backsliding. So yeah.
Right. There were some very interesting points there, Tabish. Thank you so much for joining us on the session of LitFestx. And
Thank you.
good luck with your recent books and for your upcoming ones. And wish you all the best.